It looks like things are trending in the right direction for the New Orleans Saints and Derek Carr as he is in concussion protocol. But the big question is, will the New Orleans Saints make the right decision if he's not ready to go in a couple of weeks? We got all of that and a little bit of land yap for you on today's episode of Locked On Saints.
You are Locked On Saints, your daily New Orleans Saints podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is good, Who Dat Nation and Who Dat family? Welcome in to another episode of Locked On Saints, your daily podcast covering your favorite team, the New Orleans Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you, as always, for making Locked On Saints your first listen of the day every day. Don't forget you can subscribe and follow for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts so you never miss the latest episodes. And if you want to keep the conversation going, take part in our exclusive film studies, Q&As, and much more, just text Who Dat to 504-285-7473 to join the Locked On Saints Insider community I would love for you to be a part of. As always, I am your host, Ross Jackson, at Ross Jackson Nola on your favorite social media, your New Orleans Saints expert, credential member of the media, Saints News Network, Tuesdays on the Locked On NFL podcast, and here with you every single Monday through Friday on Locked On Saints. And today's episode of Locked On Saints is brought to you by our friends at Jase Medical. Empower yourself by purchasing the Jase case, which will provide you with a personal supply of 5 different antibiotics to treat over 50 different infections. Get yours today at jasemedical.com. That's JASE medical.com. On today's episode, we're going to be taking a look at what we didn't like and what's most concerning from the Saints' loss to the Minnesota Vikings. We're going to go through what we did like because, believe it or not, there were some positives from this game. And we're going to kick it all off with all of the injury updates that you need, which are a blend of good news, bad news. Let's start off with quarterback Derek Carr. Derek Carr now in concussion protocol. The big question ahead for Derek Carr and the New Orleans Saints is, will they make the right decision if Derek Carr isn't ready to go ahead of the game against the Atlanta Falcons? And I'm talking about clears concussion protocol, all through that stuff, but is he going to be ready to go? We kind of saw the Saints rush back to get him back. We saw him rush back after a week of not practicing at all with the right shoulder injury following the Green Bay Packers game. We saw what happened in that Tampa Bay Buccaneers game, the little bit of like frantic nature that came with that game, a little bit of a lack of arm strength, all these other things that we saw, or consistent arm strength, I'll say. When he was mad, he got it down the field, that's for sure. But on a consistent level, was he making the throws the way that he could have? All of those other things. So lots of questions go into this beyond, can Derek Carr clear a concussion protocol? The timeline's actually on the right side when it comes to that part. We've seen quarterbacks come back within 2 weeks under concussion protocol. We've seen one quarterback, Brock Purdy, come back within a week on concussion protocol, although that seemed very questionable. And that's the version that you want to see the New Orleans Saints avoid here with Derek Carr. The good news, though, is that they have the bye week, so they effectively get 2 weeks built in for him to make his way through concussion protocol and show that he's good to keep moving forward. Concussions impact everybody differently and in many different ways. So let's see what happens with Derek Carr here. But hopefully for the Saints, they'll be able to at least have the option to go back to Derek Carr immediately and have him going. That's the direction that they want to go. That's the direction they would like to go. And so ideally, that's the direction that they'll have the opportunity to make the decision around. However, the Saints will need to make the right choice, even if he clears concussion protocol, but things don't seem like they're fully there yet. Then they should feel comfortable moving ahead with Jameis Winston for this week going up against the Atlanta Falcons, or for next week, rather, going up against the Atlanta Falcons. Just want to see them make the right decision here and not rush Derek Carr back in a game that you can win without him if you needed to up against Atlanta. When we look at the other 2 big injuries for New Orleans, which include Marshon Lattimore and Michael Thomas. We spoke with Dennis Allen over the conference call yesterday. He told us Derek Carr was in concussion protocol. The right shoulder checks out, all fine there. But when it came to Lattimore and Thomas, quote unquote, fairly significant injuries is what Dennis Allen said to us. Doesn't seem that their season ending. They're getting additional opinions and information and all those other things, but could be something that keeps these guys out for a game or 2, even with the bye week. So I would definitely keep an eye out on this. Michael Thomas took a helmet to the knee, the second play of the game from scrimmage on his big catch. And then Marshon Lattimore, reportedly from Ian Rappaport over at NFL Network, dealing with a high ankle sprain and is week to week. But I wouldn't be surprised to see the New Orleans Saints go cautious on those 2 guys as well. You can win against the Atlanta Falcons without Michael Thomas and without Marshon Lattimore. Alontae Taylor, as well as, of course, Isaac Yiadom, have played fantastic on the outside. Alontae Taylor tends to take the base snaps opposite Paulson Adebo. So when I say base snaps, I mean 4 down linemen, 3 linebackers, and 4 defensive backs. But then when they go into the nickel set, to where usually they swap out a linebacker for an additional corner, they'll move Alontae Taylor inside and have Isaac Yiadom play on the outside. And that has gone well for New Orleans. They had to do that earlier on this season when Paulson Adebo was dealing with some injuries. Paulson Adebo has been playing extremely well. Had some, lapses and things like that in the game against the Minnesota Vikings, but also almost had an interception on the first drive. You should feel pretty comfortable with Paulson Adebo still on the one side and then Isaac Yiadom on the other. So I wouldn't be surprised to see the Saints play with a little bit of caution on that, especially knowing the history of high ankle sprains here in New Orleans and the way that they've impacted players before. And similarly with Michael Thomas, Atlanta's usually a Taysom Hill game. Last week should have been a Taysom Hill game. The Saints weren't able to get Taysom involved and then never really got back to the run game, even when they had opportunities to do so late. But in that case, and in this game coming up after the bye week, you'd love to see, as a part of their, reevaluation and reset and everything, that they're evaluating how successful Taysom Hill allows them to be when he's properly mixed into a matchup. And he tends to have a lot of success against the Atlanta Falcons. So you could go into this game with it being a big game, expecting a big game from Taysom Hill, which maybe alleviates you a little bit from having to rely on the passing game. So that could give you the ability to be cautious with guys like Derek Carr, should there be lingering signs in that concussion. And of course, with Michael Thomas, as you want to maximize his time and ability to be able to come back. This team thinks it's a playoff team. And if that's the case, save your talent for right now. Don't rush them back out there unless you feel it's going to hinder you from winning games and getting in the playoffs. I don't think you have to worry about that with this version of the Atlanta Falcons, who are a little bit of a putrid football team. So I think that the Saints could be cautious here. A couple of other injuries right now for New Orleans. Alontae Taylor had back spasms. He's fine. Malcolm Roach, not quite sure what happened with him, but saw him after the game, said he's fine. So not too worried about either of those guys at the moment. But the big names that you're watching are huge names for this team: Derek Carr, Marshon Lattimore, and of course, Michael Thomas. The New Orleans Saints went ahead and added a player this week. They brought in Jason Pierre-Paul, who played in 14 games last year against the Baltimore Ravens. Recently also played within the NFC South division for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. The Saints are very familiar with him. They're clearly looking at some opportunities to be able to bolster the pass rush. From what I understand, the Saints did go down the road of trying to trade for a pass rusher. You Locked On Insiders probably knew that one already from our last Q&A. But there's, they clearly see that they need help from their pass rush. They're 26th in the NFL right now with 18 sacks, only 7 of those coming from defensive ends, 5.5 of them coming from, or 5 to 5.5 of them coming from Carl Granderson and Cam Jordan, sitting with only 2 on the season so far. Saints need some help when it comes to generating pass rush. The concern with Jason Pierre-Paul is finishing plays at the quarterback. Played 14 games last year for the Baltimore Ravens, 21 pressures, 18 of which were hurries, no hits, 3 sacks. A lot of pressuring the quarterback, but not affecting the pass or not getting the quarterback down to the ground. So this could be another one to where you look at it and you go, okay, there's a chance that Jason Pierre-Paul can be helpful in terms of depth and rotation, but how much of an impact he has is going to really be measured by how often he can get to the quarterback and actually make a play at the quarterback, because that's what the New Orleans Saints have failed to do consistently on the offensive side so far this season, with 7 games ahead and an opportunity after the bye week to turn that around. He's been signed to the practice squad, but I don't expect that it will take very long for him to get up to the active roster. Coming up next, let's take a look at what we liked from the loss. And the defensive line, although hasn't been producing as a pass rush, definitely did something very, very well against the Minnesota Vikings that's not going to get talked about. So let's talk about it. We got that coming up for you as we continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode of Locked On Saints is brought to you by our friends at Jase Medical. Look, you and I have been talking for a long time, so let's talk about something a little personal here. You want to be prepared in case of any type of weather events, in case of any kind of extended travel. Maybe you get stuck somewhere or something like that. That's one of the reasons why I love Jase Medical, because it allows you to be prepared and to keep you and your family taken care of and safe. One of my favorite things is the fact that you can get up to a 1-year supply of different daily medications, as well as, of course, the Jase case that helps to provide you with potential life-saving antibiotics. So there's really cool stuff for you to check out here. JaseMedical.com. See if you can get a 12-month supply of your daily medication. And remember to use the promo code Locked On at checkout to get a discount as well. Lots of people have praised Jase Medical for their ability to be able to divert any supply issues in terms of being able to get most of their daily meds there in terms of a 1-year supply. Prices are lower than local pharmacies. Highly recommended by a lot of folks. So really, really cool stuff for you to check out here. So if you or someone you love would benefit from a little bit of peace of mind of having a year supply of any of their daily medications, go to JaseMedical.com to see if yours is offered for you. Remember to use that promo code as well, Locked On, LOCKEDON, for $20 off of your purchase. All right, family, continuing on with today's episode of Locked On Saints. Though the New Orleans Saints defensive line and defense has been disappointing in terms of getting after the passer and the pass rush, the run defense took a major step forward against the Minnesota Vikings. Appreciate all of you everydayers out there for making Locked On Saints your first listen of the day every day. Look, I know you probably just kind of turned your nose up at me when I said that because you're thinking about Josh Dobbs scrambling around, extending plays, running for first downs, all these other things. And you're probably also thinking about Gardner Minshew and Trevor Lawrence and Tyson Bagent. I don't blame you. But when I talk about the run defense here, what I mean is pulling the quarterback out of it. Okay. We know the Saints lack discipline when it comes to going up against mobile quarterbacks. They lack the ability to consistently get after and make plays on quarterbacks, period. And everything. I get all that. But what I'm focusing on right now is quarterback snaps the ball, turns around, hands it off to a running back. The running back has to look for a place to go. The New Orleans Saints were outstanding in run defense in this game. If you pull out Josh Dobbs, 8 carries or 8 rushes for 44 yards, that means that the New Orleans Saints allowed just around 81 yards of rushing to the Minnesota Vikings on 25 carries. That's about 3.2 yards per carry. They were outstanding. And one of the things that ended up benefiting them big time against this Minnesota Vikings run game is one of the things that we highlighted back last week. The Minnesota Vikings are slow. They're slow. And I mean processing wise for the running backs, and the running backs themselves don't have a lot of bursts of speed. Ty Chandler maybe gives you a little bit of that from Minnesota, but the New Orleans Saints were able to play faster than the run game, faster in the run game than the Minnesota Vikings. They also struggle to really hold blocks, especially in zone blocking. Another thing that we highlighted before this game that New Orleans would be able to take advantage of. Now, again, as we always talk about it, you can stop the run all you want. If you can't stop the pass, you're losing the game. That's one of the reasons why I kept talking about going into this season that if the Saints are a middle of the road run defense, but still a top 3 passing defense, that they will be a top 10 defense in the NFL. They will keep points off the board. The issue for New Orleans in that game is that they struggled against the pass, especially against the tight end. But we're here to talk about what we liked. And what I liked was the incorporation of stunts and twists on the run game or in the run game. It confused the ever-loving everything out of that Minnesota Vikings offensive line. The other thing is the stamina of the New Orleans Saints defensive line. Saints defensive line outlasted consistently in zone blocking, in man blocking, whatever situation they were put up against. They ended up outlasting them consistently in the run game and being able to beat them to the punch, beat them to a spot, shed the blocks, all those other things. This Minnesota Vikings offensive line does not hold blocks very well. The Saints were able to take advantage of that. Colin Saunders was an absolute wrecking machine when it came to the run game and had maybe his best performance in that area. Same thing for Malcolm Roach until he, had to deal with his injury and all that. But there were a lot of really good things coming from all that. You even saw Alontae Taylor make a fantastic play in the run game, crashing off the left side of the offensive line and getting to the quarterback and the running back effectively at the mesh point. So you saw some really good steps forward for this New Orleans Saints run defense. But just like we talked about with the Saints offense earlier on in the season, is it that the run defense was really, really good? Or was it that the Minnesota Vikings run blocking was really, really bad? Because we have to be honest here. The Minnesota Vikings offense, really, really bad when it came to run blocking. However, what the New Orleans Saints did independently of the blocking, filling the run fits, getting where you needed to get, making tackles, beating offensive linemen to the punch. The stunts and twists were well executed. let alone whether or not were they effective against the offensive line, which they were. They were executed very well, very precisely. Everyone maintained their discipline. Everybody maintained their gaps. They did a really good job for the most part against the run. So when I look at the things that are independent of the performance of the Minnesota Vikings offensive line, the Saints put up some good teach tape for themselves moving forward in terms of how they should be playing the run and utilizing the athleticism that they do have. This is not a very fast defense, but this is a good defense when it comes to lateral speed, moving sideways, moving sideline to sideline, and being able to cover a lot of ground that way. And I think that those are the things that the New Orleans Saints run defense needs to start relying upon. And we saw a little bit of that creep into this game against the Minnesota Vikings and go very well for New Orleans. So I really, really, really love what we saw from the run defense. The other thing that I think that I really liked that we saw from this game is, or were rather, the wide receivers. Look, this was a good example of how the Saints have the talent that they need, but don't consistently take advantage of it. Jameis Winston comes in, and all of a sudden his communication, his comfort with the wide receivers shows immediately. Putting passes in places where only the receiver can get to them, where he knows the receivers can get to them. That happened with both Chris Olave and A.T. Perry's touchdown passes. Were it not for the offensive offsides penalty, you saw another really nice one to the cover two shot, the cover two hole shot that they took to Chris Olave on the right sideline, all that. It was all there in terms of what you want to see between a quarterback and the wide receivers. That's not to say that Derek Carr is actively ignoring that. It's just that Derek Carr has been in the system for 10 games. Jameis Winston has been in the system for years and has worked with these receivers for multiple years. Even Rashid Shaheed, who he didn't technically throw a pass to at all last year, he and Rashid Shaheed were rehabbing together before the season began last year, before training camp in the offseason, and they got very close during that time. Jameis Winston told me that personally last year. It's in one of the YouTube shorts over on the YouTube channel. So you can see a lot of that in this game in terms of the chemistry between all that, and that when the ball is put in some of those maybe risky situations, but when they're calculated risk, which is what we said the New Orleans Saints needed to be early on in this season, before the season even began, that those wide receivers were able to go out and win those matchups. It's when, you launch one up because you get pressure up the middle immediately, and it falls towards the inside as Chris Olave is fading towards the outside running the red line. It's when you launch a pass into triple coverage down the field. Yes, Jameis Winston's front foot slipped on that throw, might have sailed the throw a little bit, but still the decision, which he himself said was not the right decision on that play, was not the right decision on that play. So you got the ups and the downs of taking risks. And in a game where you're down 16 points, in a game where you're down, 24 points, 21 points, you're going to take those calculated risks. So good on them for doing that. I do think that finding a way to blend that with Derek Carr's overly conservative nature will help. Now, look, the Saints take a bunch of shots down the field. They lead the NFL in targets downfield 20 yards or more, and have for most of the season, if not all of it. So whether it's Derek Carr or it's Jameis Winston, they're taking shots. But I do think the aggressive nature of Jameis Winston throwing into tighter windows is something that Derek Carr can incorporate in his game. And Derek Carr's ability to see and take the checkdowns and not, put the ball at massive risk is something that Jameis Winston would be able to benefit from. So some blend of the right sides of each of these quarterbacks could go a long way for the New Orleans Saints. So hopefully the scheme starts to open up in that way for Derek Carr when he reassumes quarterback, as we know the New Orleans Saints are riding forward with Derek Carr. Coming up next, let's get to what's most concerning about the New Orleans Saints loss against the Minnesota Vikings. And while a lot of people are going to focus on the pass rush, I'm looking at something different over on the offensive side. We got that coming up for you as we continue on and wrap up today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode of Locked On Saints brought to you by our friends at FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NFL and America's #1 sportsbook. And right now, it just got even more #1-ier to go over to FanDuel, especially if you've never used FanDuel before. Right now, new customers are going to get $150 in bonus bets by simply winning a $5 money line bet. That's it. That means you can go and bet on a heavy favorite, for instance, and get that done. The Las Vegas Raiders are on a 2-game win streak. They take that momentum into Miami against the Dolphins. The Dolphins are favored 11.5 points. Maybe you feel like that's too big a spread. Maybe you feel like that's a heavy bet that you'd like to lean into in favor of the Miami Dolphins. Either way, you put that down, put $5 down as a new customer. If you get that right, you win not only the earnings from getting that right, but also $150 in bonus bets if your team wins. If you have been thinking about joining FanDuel, right now is an absolute time to get in on the action, not want to miss out on this deal. All those bonus bets, for instance, can be used for things like spreads, more money line bets, player props, over-unders, and much more. So visit FanDuel.com/lockedon today to keep the NFL season rolling in style. FanDuel, official partner of the NFL. Let's get it, Who Dat Nation. Wrapping up today's episode of Locked On Saints with a look at what was most concerning in the New Orleans Saints loss to the Minnesota Vikings. So I told you a lot of people are going to focus on the pass rush, and I think that's valid. I'm focusing on something a little bit more over on the offensive side, and then I have a little bit more of an overarching kind of umbrella topic that I want to highlight. That was, I think, on full display in this game. So let's start off over on the offensive side. I do think that the defensive line is a concern. I also think that the New Orleans Saints offensive line is a concern. Their sack numbers over the course of the past 4 games before this game against the Minnesota Vikings have kind of masked it a little bit. You're seeing a lot of conversation and saw a lot of conversation during that time about how the New Orleans Saints offensive line was performing much better. All those other things. I asked Dennis Allen how he thought that the offensive line performed up against the Minnesota Vikings. The answer that he gave is that he didn't think it was a poor performance, but he definitely saw some places where this could have gone a little bit better. I think it was a poor performance. I'm just going to be honest, especially in the screen game. There were several times where you had the exact setup that you needed, called against the blitz, which the Minnesota Vikings, by the way, did not blitz as aggressively as they usually do. They toned that back against the New Orleans Saints. They also only dropped 8 back 9 times in this game outside of the 61 different defensive plays that they ran. So Minnesota really changed things up against the New Orleans Saints defense or offense, but the opportunities were still there. And when you've got a screen pass and a dump off that lines up perfectly and your offensive linemen are running past defenders instead of blocking them, massive issue in a game like this. And massive issue from just a football standpoint. Like, those are errors that should not be being made. And we also saw a lot of pressure. We saw immediate pressure. We saw pressure that, Jamal Williams at one point, there was a player coming right up the middle and he kind of dove off to the side. That player kind of, juked around and then got a clear shot on the quarterback, for instance. And it's just things like that in terms of protection are inexcusable. And so what we talked about going into this game was that the Saints haven't actually been warding off pressure. They haven't seen a ton of it. They're sitting around 25% through the first 5 games versus through the last 4 games before the Minnesota Vikings game going into this one. So there hasn't been a decline in pressures at all. The decline has happened in pressure to sack ratio, which means Derek Carr was getting the ball out quickly, which is measurable. 2.5 seconds versus 2.3 seconds over the course of the last 4 games. So that ended up having a big impact. So I think that we all kind of got shinied into, the New Orleans Saints offensive line is performing better, but we've been trying to tell you, no, it actually hasn't. Derek Carr just getting the ball out quickly. He's throwing passes away at a greater rate. He's not allowing it or taking sacks and all these other things. We saw the ball get held on to quite a bit more in this one. We saw pressure in this one. We saw an inability to block in the screen game in this one. We saw struggles, again, blocking in the run game in this one, although I thought Alvin Kamara did a lot with what was given to him in this game when it came to the run game. So for me, you're not going to win games that way. And there's no way that you look at this after having already 6 different combinations on the offensive line and say, if they just shuffle it around, it'll get better. No, it hasn't. This was the first actually talented pass rush that the New Orleans Saints have gone up against, and they lost the battle. They lost that battle big time. So for me, the defensive line struggled for sure, but the offensive line is far more concerning for you, because if your offensive line can't hold up, you're not doing anything on offense. And to me, that's a big concern. So that's my number one thing. The other thing that I have to highlight here is you saw the massive difference in coaching in this game. It is so clear Kevin O'Connell was in his bag in this game, and especially setting up a game for a quarterback in Joshua Dobbs, who hadn't even been in the system for more than 2 weeks, that was still looking at cheat sheets to learn other players' names, didn't know, when he walked into the stadium, how to get to the home locker room, all these other things, just brand new as things can be, right? And as many people that are making fun of all that stuff, hello, welcome to being somewhere new for the first time. That's kind of how it works. But when he got out on the field and he was running that system, he looked like he's been running that system, especially in the first half, for years. And that is a nod to Kevin O'Connell. And I think if you look around the NFL right now and you look at the quarterbacks that are performing well within their systems, you look at how good a Brock Purdy was with Kyle Shanahan in that system. You look at Who's another kind of like average to above average quarterback? Jared Goff. Jared Goff and the Detroit Lions with Ben Johnson. Look how they maximize that talent. You look at the way that CJ Stroud has performed in Bobby Slowick's offense, maximizing the talent with the scheme, all of that. There was another quarterback that I was just thinking of as well, who kind of falls in that same category as also. But there's a few. Josh Dobbs. I think you could look at Josh Dobbs in the Kevin O'Connell offense, who's doing more Shanahan-y things this year than he's doing McVay-y things this year. Updates on the offense. Updated offense ends up benefiting that quarterback. You have a 9-year, 10-year veteran quarterback in Derek Carr who can play the game well, but look at the difference. Look at the difference. It's massive. The difference in coaching between and the difference in system between Kevin O'Connell and what the New Orleans Saints are doing on offense right now. Like, that's got to be a conversation here over the course of the bye week. You can't change anything. You're not going to be able to change your system. But man, like when it comes to the offseason, you got to be ready to update this offense big time because it ain't working. And there's no reason that a quarterback like Derek Carr, and even to an extent a quarterback like Jameis Winston, should be struggling in an offense with this much talent around them, right? Like, the shortcomings come with the fact that they don't use motion, they don't use play action, they're not creative on the offensive side. They're not doing those things. Like, but then you look at the offenses around the NFL and the quarterbacks that are excelling in those offenses. I'm not even talking about Jalen Hurts and Patrick Mahomes and all these. That's not who I'm talking about at all. I'm talking about Jared Goff and Joshua Dobbs and CJ Stroud, who's phenomenal. He was my QB1 going into this year, but also leading or nearly leading the NFL in passing yards, is leading the NFL in passing yards per game right now. And there's no, wait till they get the tape on CJ Stroud. He's been doing that dang thing for 9 weeks already. 10 games, 9 games, however many he's played. Like, there's no excuse, right? So I look at that. Sam Howell with the Washington Commanders leads the NFL in passing yards right now. Like, these are not top tier quarterbacks, although CJ Stroud will be, but these are not top tier quarterbacks. These are good quarterbacks. And Derek Carr is a good quarterback. And there's no reason why this New Orleans Saints offense should be lagging behind the way that, or lagging behind what we're seeing other good quarterbacks, not great, good quarterbacks do around the NFL. Because to me, in my mind, Derek Carr is better than those guys outside of CJ Stroud, who's going to be a star in the NFL. All right, coming up tomorrow. Sorry, I don't know if I ended up on a heated note there. Not trying to beat anything over the head, but do want to talk about what's concerning. And I do think that it's important to look at the measure of the systems around the NFL based on the measure of the quarterbacks that are succeeding in them versus the struggles that the New Orleans Saints are having. I do think that that is an important conversation. Coming up in tomorrow's episode, it's going to be Wednesday, so we're going to go through Film Watch. We're going to do the actual film study and everything, film breakdown, and drawing on the screen and showing you the plays and all of this stuff over at Subtext with the Locked On Saints Insider Program. You want to take part in that? Just text Who Dat to 504-285-7473, 504-285-7473. Just text Who Dat to there to get all set up, signed up. You can do that 14 days, and then if you want to keep on after that, it's $4.99 a month. Film studies, Q&As, insider access, early stuff for me, all that is in there directly to your phone, not having to deal with those social media apps. And then here on the show on Wednesday, we'll be talking about all the notes from the film breakdown. So we'll go through and hit all the points as well. But if you want to see the diagrams and stuff like that, I can't do those on YouTube. All right, I appreciate you as always for coming through and making Locked On Saints your first listen of the day every day. And I thank you endlessly for making Locked On Saints a part of your day, part of your routine, for saying yes to me and the show. As always, if you see me, please say hi. And if you need anything else around your New Orleans Saints in between these episodes, make sure you follow me on your favorite social media at Ross Jackson, NOLA. Hit me up. Let me know how the family's doing. Let me know how you're living. Let me know how you're momming them. And trust you, that nation. I'll holla at you.